In the summer of 1832, it was no longer a question of if people would die, only how many. It began with relentless purging, violent vomiting, endless diarrhea, as the body flushed itself uncontrollably. Across cities and ports, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Skin turned cold and bluish as the body drained itself. In a single day, a person could lose more water than they could drink in a week. For many, it felt like the end of the world as humanity confronted one of the deadliest pandemics in its history. In the first week of June, 1832, the people of Canada were focused on surviving the winter. They were worried about the firewood running low, but they should have been watching the ocean. The St. Lawrence River was calm, glittering under the summer sun. To the naked eye, it was the beginning of a season of trade and prosperity. Ships were arriving from across the Atlantic, their white sails billowing like clouds against the blue sky. They carried the most valuable cargo in the British Empire: people, thousands of them. Families from Ireland, England, and Scotland, leaving behind a world of famine and poverty, looking for a second chance in the vast green forests of Canada. But as the brig Carrick drifted slowly up the river, the people on the docks didn't know that the ship was already a floating tomb. It had left Dublin weeks earlier with 145 passengers. By the time it reached the Canadian shore, 42 of them were dead. Their bodies had been sewn into canvas sacks and slid silently into the grey Atlantic. The survivors huddled on the deck, pale and terrified. They brought with them their trunks, their meagre savings, and their hopes. But they also brought something else. A passenger that wasn't listed on the manifest. A passenger that was microscopic. They called it Cholera morbus, the Blue Death. To understand the nightmare of 1832, we have to start before the epidemic even reached the shore. The 1830s saw one of the greatest mass migrations in human history. In Ireland, the potato crops were failing, and the English landlords were clearing their estates. For thousands of Irish families, the choice was simple: leave or starve. They scraped together every penny they had to buy passage to Quebec in Canada. What they got was the steerage deck of a timber ship. These vessels were not designed for humans. They were built to haul lumber from the Canadian forests to Britain. But the ship owners realized that on the return trip to Canada, they could pack the empty cargo holds with human beings. They became known as coffin ships. Hundreds of people were crammed into bunk beds stacked 3 high. There was no sanitation. A few buckets in the corner served as toilets for hundreds of people. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. It was the perfect laboratory for disease. The bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, thrives in dirty water. In the cramped conditions of a coffin ship, once one person got sick, the entire hold was condemned. The water barrels, often sitting open and uncovered, became reservoirs of death. Death became a daily routine. When a passenger passed away, there could be no proper funeral and no marked grave. To protect the living from infection, bodies had to be removed quickly, wrapped in canvas and committed to the ocean. By the time these ships entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, the people inside were already broken. They were malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized. They came looking for paradise, but they had sailed through hell to get there, and they were bringing the hell with them. 30 miles downstream from Quebec City lies a small, beautiful island called Grosse Île. Today, it is a National Historic Site, a quiet place of grass and trees. This was the quarantine station. Every ship coming up the river had to stop here. A doctor would board, inspect the passengers, and if anyone was sick, the ship would be held under a yellow flag, the universal symbol of plague. By then, the officials at Grosse Île were expecting around 30,000 immigrants for the entire season. They had a small staff, a few wooden sheds for a hospital, and a limited supply of medicine. But then, the floodgates opened. In a single week in June, dozens of ships arrived at once. The river was clogged with vessels dropping anchor, waiting for inspection. On those ships were over 50,000 people. The system collapsed instantly. The medical staff was overwhelmed. Dr. George Douglas, the medical superintendent, worked about 20-hour days, wading through a sea of human misery. But there was nothing he could do. The hospital sheds were full within hours. Soon, the sick were being laid out on the grass, under the open sky. Tents were pitched, but there weren't enough. The healthy were separated from the sick, but on an island that small, there was no real separation. The bacteria was in the soil, and most critically, it was in the water. The tragic irony of Grosse Île is that the doctors didn't know what caused cholera. This was decades before the germ theory of disease. They didn't know about bacteria. They believed in miasma, the idea that diseases were spread by bad smells, by night air, or by the moral failings of the poor. So, while the doctors tied handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar around their faces to block the smell, they continued to drink from the island's wells. The quarantine station became a death trap. Instead of stopping the disease, the island amplified it. It became a factory for cholera. And when the overwhelmed officials finally cleared the healthy passengers to continue on to Quebec City and Montreal, they didn't realize they were sending ticking time bombs into the heart of the continent. Before we continue, let's take some time to understand the disease itself. Cholera doesn't kill you with fever. It kills you with dehydration. When the bacteria enters the digestive system, it releases a toxin that causes the walls of the intestine to reverse their function. Instead of absorbing water into the body, they begin to pump water out. The result is a sudden, uncontrollable purging. A victim can lose 10 to 20 liters of fluid in a single day. When you lose that much volume that quickly, the blood thickens into a sludge that looks like tar. The heart struggles to pump this thick sludge through the veins. The capillaries collapse. This leads to the symptom that gave the disease its nickname. As the oxygen is starved from the tissues, the skin turns a pale, deathly grey. And then, as the end approaches, a deep, bruised blue. Witnesses describe the transformation as horrifying. A young, healthy woman of 20 would look like a woman of 80 within hours. During that time, medical treatments were almost as bad as the disease. Because doctors believed the disease was caused by an excess of blood or bad humors, they often administered brandy and cayenne pepper, thinking the heat would fight the chill of the disease. The quarantine failed. The invisible passenger boarded the steamboats heading upriver. First, it hit Quebec City. Then, on June 8th, the steamboat Voyageur arrived in the harbour of Montreal. Montreal in 1832 was the metropolis of Canada. It felt safe. But by the evening of June 9th, the first bodies were found in the boarding houses near the port. The newspapers, which had been downplaying the risk, suddenly changed their tone. The headlines screamed of the arrival of the Asiatic Cholera. The city shut down. The shops boarded up their windows. The wealthy families packed their carriages and fled to the countryside. For those left behind, the city became a prison. The sound of the wooden wheels and the cry of "Bring out your dead" became the soundtrack of the summer. Mass graves were dug in the St. Antoine Cemetery, now Dorchester Square. The disease spread to Toronto, they tried, but you cannot quarantine the water. As the summer turned to autumn, the cold weather finally came. The frost killed the bacteria. The death carts stopped running. The fires in the streets were extinguished. In Toronto, the epidemic changed the city's shape. The mass graves, hastily dug in what is now St. James Park, were covered over with grass. But the fear remained. Walk through downtown Toronto today. Walk through St. James Park on a sunny afternoon. You will see people eating lunch on the grass. You will see children playing. We forget how fragile our world really is. The epidemic of 1832 was a horror story. Yes, it forced a rough collection of trading posts to build the infrastructure, the sewers, the hospitals, the water treatment plants that keeps us alive today. Hope you enjoyed this videos. Please subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.